40 minutes. That was how long Nathaniel Cross sat outside the executive floor of Sterling Industries. A plain resume rested on his knee as he waited to be called in for his interview. Through the gap in the door he could hear them laughing, passing his resume from hand to hand, mocking his age, his clothes, the years he had stepped back from his career to hold his family together. He said nothing. He only watched the clock. At the 40th minute, he stood, made a single short phone call, and before another minute had passed, every person laughing behind the door received a notice of termination. The city moved the way it always did on a Tuesday morning, gray, indifferent, and Nathaniel moved with it. He came up out of the parking garage beneath Sterling Industries carrying nothing but a thin leather folder and a resume printed the night before on plain paper. The building climbed 41 stories of glass above him, the kind of headquarters built to make a person feel small before they ever reached the front desk. He had built and rebuilt companies inside towers just like it, and he had learned long ago that the taller the glass, the harder the fall once the culture inside finally cracked. For most of 2 decades his name had carried weight in the rooms where corporate turnarounds were decided. He was the man boards called when a major company was quietly bleeding out and no one wanted to say so in public. He would arrive without fanfare, study the wreckage, and rebuild from the load-bearing walls up. Then, at the peak of that reputation, he had walked away from all of it for several years to hold his family together through a period that had nearly broken him. Those were the years people now whispered about, as if stepping out of the race had been surrender rather than the hardest work of his life. Sterling Industries was the reason he'd come back. The company had once been a respected, profitable leader in industrial systems. Over 3 years it had slid from one loss into the next, and the board couldn't find a single line on a spreadsheet that explained why. The products were sound. The market was there. Whatever was rotting lived somewhere the numbers couldn't reach in the way the company treated its own people. The board had finally admitted as much in a closed session 2 weeks earlier, and offered Nathaniel the role of chief operating officer. He accepted on one condition: no announcement, no photo in the lobby, no memo to the leadership team. Edmund Reyes, the chairman of the board, had listened to the request across a quiet table and understood it faster than Nathaniel expected. A culture only shows its true face to the powerless, and Nathaniel intended to walk in as the most powerless person a company like this could imagine, a middle-aged applicant with a gap in his work history, there to watch what leadership did when they believed no one important was looking. So the resume in his folder was true in every detail but one. It carried his real history of turnarounds, his real years away, his real name printed plainly across the top. It simply didn't mention that the board had already signed him as their new COO, or that Edmund had granted him full authority to act the moment he decided he'd seen enough. The interview was a fiction the leadership team believed completely. Everything Nathaniel was about to witness would be entirely real. He gave his name at the front desk as a candidate for the executive operations role and was sent up to the top floor. The elevator opened onto a reception area of pale stone and cold light, where a young woman at a curved desk checked her screen and asked him to have a seat. He thanked her, sat down with the folder on his knee, and settled into the particular stillness of a man who had already decided to wait as long as it took. The 3 people who ran the daily life of Sterling Industries had no idea who had just arrived on their floor. Marcus Kane was the executive vice president, and he wore the title as though it had been stamped into him at birth somewhere in his late 40s, expensively dressed, carrying the easy contempt of a man who had never once been made to wait. He treated the company as a stage for his own performance and everyone beneath him as furniture to be rearranged when convenient. Diane Whitmore ran human resources, which should have made her the one person in the building trained to see a candidate as a human being. Instead, she had learned to read people the way an auditor reads a ledger, scanning for what could be dismissed. She joined Sterling only months earlier and had never been shown the confidential board files, a detail that would matter more than she could know. For now it only meant she had no reason to connect a name to a face she'd already decided not to respect. Preston Locke was the chief strategy officer, younger than the other 2 and sharper in a way that had curdled into cruelty. He mistook his own quickness for wisdom, and after years of being clever in meetings, he'd stopped noticing the difference between insight and mockery. Together the 3 of them formed a kind of weather system, and everyone else on the floor had learned to watch the sky. It was Preston who first noticed the man waiting in reception. He stepped out of the glass-walled conference room they all called the tank, glanced at Nathaniel, and went back inside wearing the look of someone who'd found fresh entertainment for the room. The receptionist had left Nathaniel's resume at the desk, and within minutes it had traveled through the door the executives had left open just enough for sound to carry. Nathaniel heard the paper pass from hand to hand. He heard the first laugh before he heard the first word, and he did not look up. "Tell me this is a joke," Marcus said, loud enough to carry. "Somebody actually scheduled this." "HR scheduled it," Diane answered, no defense in her voice at all, only amusement. "He applied through the regular portal. I figured we could all use something to lighten the morning." Preston read a line aloud in the flat, mocking cadence people use when they want a sentence to sound ridiculous. "Says here he stepped away from executive work for several years for family reasons." The word family landed in the room and broke apart into laughter. Nathaniel heard Marcus repeat it, dragging it out, shrinking it into something shameful. Through the gap in the door he could see the edge of the conference table and the shapes of them leaning toward each other. He kept his eyes on the clock above the reception desk, watching the second hand complete its slow, honest circle. "So he quits at the top of his career," Marcus said, "and now what, a decade later he wants to walk back through the front door like nothing happened, into an executive ops role at my company. His clothes came off a rack. Look at the cut of that jacket," Preston added. "This is a man who hasn't sat in a real boardroom in years." Diane's voice cut in, cooler and somehow worse for its calm. "The gap is the problem. You can't leave a career that long and expect the market to hold your seat. That's not how any of this works. He should know that better than anyone at his age." Nathaniel listened to the three of them agree with one another, and he felt the thing he'd come to find begin to reveal itself. It wasn't the mockery itself, mockery existed in every building. It was the ease of it. The comfort. The fact that none of them lowered their voices, that not one of them glanced toward reception to check whether the man they were dismantling could hear every word. They weren't being careless. They simply didn't believe he mattered enough to be careful around. A junior strategist named Maya Chen was standing by the printer just outside the tank when the laughter started. She'd been at Sterling a little over a year, long enough to understand how the leadership floor worked, not long enough to stop being sickened by it. From where she stood she could see the man in reception clearly, the folder on his knee, the stillness in his shoulders. She could hear every word the executives said about him. She wanted to walk over and say something, anything, that would tell him not everyone in the building was cut from the same cold cloth. But she also knew exactly what it cost to speak up on that floor. She'd watched two colleagues try, and watched both of them get quietly reassigned into roles designed to push them out. So she stood at the printer holding pages she no longer needed, said nothing, and the silence tasted like something she'd remember. Inside the tank, the resume kept circulating. Preston found another line to perform. Marcus found another way to declare the man finished. Diane found another clinical reason the whole thing was beneath them. And somewhere in the middle of it, Marcus leaned back and delivered the line Maya would later repeat almost word for word. "People like that," Marcus said, "don't belong on this floor. They come up here, sit in our chairs, and think the smell of the carpet's going to rub off on them. It doesn't work that way. This floor isn't a place you visit, it's a place you earn." And he earned his way out of it years ago. The others laughed, and the sound drifted out to the man they were describing. The man they were describing did not move. Nathaniel had heard versions of that line before, in other towers, from other mouths aimed at assistants and applicants and anyone the powerful had decided to treat as scenery. What struck him now wasn't the cruelty. It was the certainty, the absolute confidence that the person outside the door would never be in a position to answer. That certainty was the disease. Everything the board had failed to see on their spreadsheets was living inside that one sentence, and Nathaniel had just heard it announce itself. He could have ended it right there. He carried the authority. One call to Edmund and the fiction would collapse instantly. The temptation was clean and immediate, the way any obvious exit is tempting. He let it pass, because ending it now would only have shown him what these three did when caught. It would have told him nothing about what they did when they believed, completely, that no one who could hold them accountable was watching. And that second thing was the only thing worth knowing. The company hadn't rotted because of how its leaders behaved under scrutiny. It had rotted because of how they behaved in scrutiny's absence. Nathaniel had walked in precisely to measure that absence. So he made a decision that was less about patience than diagnosis. He would sit. He would let the full 40 minutes run however long they chose to leave him there, and let the arrogance in that room climb toward its own ceiling. He wanted to see how high it would go with nothing to stop it, because that height would tell him exactly how much of Sterling Industries he was going to have to rebuild, and how deep the damage had sunk. The clock read 11 minutes past the hour when the first laugh came through the door. Nathaniel resettled the folder on his knee and slowed his breathing. He was distantly aware of the young woman near the printer, glancing toward him and away again, and he understood her stillness better than she did herself. She wasn't one of them. She was simply afraid, and fear was something a healthy company had no reason to cultivate in its own people. Inside the tank, the mockery drifted to other targets, then circled back to him, the way idle cruelty always returns to its favorite subject. Marcus called for coffee. Preston told a story that had nothing to do with the resume and everything to do with reminding the room how clever he was. Diane mentioned, as if it were a minor administrative detail, that someone should probably tell the applicant leadership was tied up and the interview might not happen today at all. No one went. The applicant sat outside their door, and they let him sit, because making him wait was its own kind of pleasure, a way of confirming to one another exactly where he stood and where they stood, and how permanent they believed the distance between those two positions to be. Nathaniel watched the second hand climb again. 15 minutes. 20. He didn't check his phone. He didn't shift with the restlessness of a man who felt his time being wasted. He held still with the specific composure of someone who had already decided every minute of this was information and that he was being paid in a currency the three people inside wouldn't understand until it was far too late for all of them. Somewhere past the 25th minute, Maya finally moved. She couldn't bring herself to confront the executives, but she could do one small thing, and she did it. She crossed to reception, crouched slightly beside the man in the chair, and offered him a cup of water and a quiet apology with no official standing at all. "They're running behind," she said, and both of them knew it wasn't true. "I'm sorry you've been kept waiting. It shouldn't be this long." Nathaniel looked at her, really looked, and what she saw in his face wasn't the beaten resignation she'd braced for. It was something steadier, almost gentle. The expression of a man who had heard everything she was too polite to say aloud, and wasn't diminished by it. "Thank you," he said, taking the water. "You didn't have to do that." "No," Maya answered, glancing once toward the glass room and back. "I didn't." She returned to her desk before anyone in the tank noticed she'd crossed the floor. Nathaniel turned the small cup slowly in his hands and understood he'd just met the one person on this floor worth protecting. She'd risked nothing dramatic, only a cup of water and a sentence. But she'd done it while the powerful were in full voice and the powerless had no way to reward her. That was the whole test, and she'd passed it without knowing a test was being given. The laughter behind the door hadn't stopped. If anything, it had grown looser, more certain of itself, filling the minutes with the comfortable noise of people who believed the morning belonged entirely to them. Nathaniel set the empty cup on the low table beside him and returned his eyes to the clock. The second hand swept upward once more, unhurried and exact, closing the distance toward the number he'd been waiting for since he sat down. 38 minutes. 39. He felt the stillness in himself shift, the way the air changes before weather. Nothing showed on his face. His hands stayed folded on the folder, his breathing stayed even, and to anyone watching he was still only a tired applicant left too long in a chair that wasn't his. But the waiting was ending now, and he knew it. The 40th minute arrived without ceremony, the second hand simply crossing the top of the clock as though it were any other moment in any other morning. Nathaniel set the folder aside beside the empty cup Maya had brought him, and stood. The movement was unhurried and complete, a man rising from a chair he had never once treated as beneath him. No one inside the tank noticed anything had changed on the floor outside their door. Behind the glass, the mockery had settled into its comfortable middle stretch, the part where cruelty stops being sharp and becomes simply habit, where the room performs to stay warm. Marcus had the resume again, reading a line about a turnaround Nathaniel had led years earlier and inventing reasons it must have been exaggerated. Preston agreed with the particular enthusiasm of a man who wanted his agreement noticed. Diane watched them both with the thin amusement of someone who considered herself the only adult in a room of children, and enjoyed the feeling too much to correct it. Nathaniel didn't walk to the door. He didn't knock. He took out his phone, stepped a few paces toward the tall windows overlooking the gray city, and made a single call that lasted less than 30 seconds. His voice, if anyone had been close enough to hear it, carried nothing dramatic. He said a name. He said he'd seen enough. He said the board could proceed. Then he ended the call, slid the phone back into his jacket, and stood at the window with his hands loose at his sides, waiting for the building to catch up to what had already happened. It didn't take long. First a phone buzzed on the conference table inside the tank. Then a second. Then, almost together, several devices lit up at once, the low, insistent hum of an alert going out to every executive account in the company on the chairman's authority. Laptops woke and displayed the same message. Phones in pockets and hands displayed it too. For a moment the laughter behind the glass thinned into confusion as three people looked down at their screens at the same time. The message was brief and left no room for interpretation. The board of directors required the entire executive leadership team to report to the main conference room immediately. The new chief operating officer had arrived. His name was Nathaniel Cross. Maya, still at her desk, felt her own phone buzz with the general staff version of the notice and looked up toward reception on instinct. The man in the plain jacket stood by the windows now, calm, unbothered. And something in the way he stood made the noise in her chest go quiet. She didn't understand yet. She was beginning to. Inside the tank, Marcus read the message twice and laughed once more, though the laugh had a different edge now, less amusement, more irritation. The new COO, he repeated. Nobody told me a new COO was starting today. Nobody runs a hire like that past the whole floor without it going through me first. Diane didn't answer right away. She was looking at the name on the alert, then at the resume still lying on the table where Marcus had dropped it, reading the same two words on both. Nathaniel Cross, the applicant they'd spent 40 minutes taking apart, and the chief operating officer the board had just announced, carried the identical name. The coincidence was too exact to be a coincidence at all. The color drained from her face slowly, the way it does when a mind arrives somewhere before the person is ready to follow. Marcus, she said, and her voice had lost its cool. The name. Look at the name on the resume. Preston leaned toward the glass wall, looked out at the floor, then back at the table, unwilling to let the thought land. It's a common enough name, he decided, in the confident tone of a man who preferred a coincidence to an explanation he couldn't control. There is one applicant on this floor this morning, Diane said, and we all know exactly who he is. That sentence hung in the room, and neither Marcus nor Preston followed it to where Diane had already gone. Marcus was the one who acted. He pushed back from the table with the offended energy of a man whose morning had been interrupted by something beneath him, and came out through the tank's doorway onto the reception floor for the first time. His eyes went to the man by the windows, the plain jacket, the tired face, the folder abandoned on the low table. And he saw exactly what he expected to see, an applicant who'd overstayed his welcome and somehow triggered a system glitch that was now Marcus's problem to clean up. You, Marcus said, crossing toward him. I don't know what you think is happening here, but this floor is close to candidates today. Whatever mix-up just went out on our system has nothing to do with you, and I need you to collect your things and leave. Nathaniel turned from the window without hurry. He looked at Marcus the way a man looks at a problem he's already solved, and said nothing that would give the moment away. He simply held the other man's gaze with a steadiness that didn't fit anything Marcus believed about him, and that small refusal to be afraid was the first thing all morning that made Marcus uncertain. I'll wait, Nathaniel said. I don't think you're finished here. Marcus's face colored. He wasn't a man who absorbed a sentence like that from someone he'd spent 40 minutes deciding was nothing. He turned toward the reception desk, lifted a hand toward the young woman there, then thought better of it and reached instead for the wall phone connected to building security. This is Marcus Kane on the executive floor, he said into it, loud enough for half the floor to hear. "I have a candidate up here who won't leave. I need someone to come walk him out." Maya watched from her desk and felt something cold move through her, because she could see what Marcus could not, the calm in the man by the window, the complete absence of the panic a person shows when security is being called on them. She understood, without being able to prove it, that Marcus was making a mistake he would not survive. Diane and Preston had come out of the tank too, but Diane's face no longer matched Preston's. He arranged himself behind Marcus with the loose confidence of a man watching a colleague handle a nuisance, and he actually smiled. "He called security on the applicant," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. "This is the most entertaining morning we've had in a month. He really thinks he belongs up here badly enough to make a scene about it." The words carried across the floor, and a few younger staffers who drifted toward the commotion looked at their shoes rather than at the man being described. They'd all heard the laughter through the door for the last hour. Now they were being asked, without anyone saying it aloud, to stand with leadership and watch a tired man get escorted out of the building. Something in the room had begun to feel wrong in a way none of them had the standing to name. Nathaniel let it happen. He didn't argue with Marcus, didn't defend himself to Preston, didn't so much as glance at the phone in Marcus's hand. He returned to the low chair he'd occupied for the last 40 minutes and sat back down, unhurried, as though the security call were happening to someone else entirely. The composure of it was more unsettling than any protest could have been. "Marcus," Diane said quietly, and there was something close to fear in it now. "The alert said the COO arrived on this floor with that name. The name on the resume you've been reading for the last hour." "The alert's a mistake," Marcus answered, though he didn't sound as sure as he had 2 minutes earlier. "And if it isn't," Diane went on, eyes on the man in the chair, "then the new chief operating officer is the man you just called security on, and we've spent the last 40 minutes. She didn't finish the sentence, because the elevator at the far end of the floor opened, and Edmund Reyes stepped out. The chairman of the board wasn't a large man, but he moved through the executive floor with the unhurried weight of someone who had signed the checks that built it. The staff who saw him first went still. Word of his presence crossed the open floor faster than he did, and by the time he was halfway to reception, the 3 executives had turned toward him with expressions already trying to rearrange themselves into welcome. Marcus set the security phone back on its cradle without finishing the call. Edmund didn't go to Marcus. He didn't go to Diane or Preston, who were already stepping forward with the reflexive smiles of people who assumed any arriving power must have come for them. He walked past all 3 as though they were part of the furniture they'd spent the morning comparing Nathaniel to, and crossed the floor to the low chair by reception, where the man in the plain jacket was rising to meet him. "Nathaniel," Edmund said, extending his hand. "I'm sorry you were kept waiting, though I understand that was rather the point." Nathaniel took the offered hand. "It told me everything I needed to know." The 2 men shook hands in full view of the entire floor, and the sound that moved through the room wasn't a sound at all, but the specific silence of dozens of people understanding the same thing at the same moment. Maya felt it land in her own chest, the pieces snapping into place, the water she'd carried across the floor, the steadiness in his face, the way he'd let Marcus call security on his own boss and never once flinched. Edmund turned so the floor could hear him, and spoke without any pleasure in it, which somehow made it worse for the 3 people frozen behind him. "For those of you who didn't read the alert carefully, let me remove any confusion. This is Nathaniel Cross. As of this morning he is Chief Operating Officer of Sterling Industries, appointed by the board with full authority to restructure this company as he sees fit. He asked to observe this floor without an introduction. I agreed to it. What he observed, he will now address." Marcus's face had gone the color of paper. "Edmund," he started, and the familiarity in his own voice sounded wrong even to him. "I had no idea. There was no announcement, no file, nothing came through the proper channels. If I had known." "If you had known," Nathaniel said, and it was the first time he'd raised his voice above ordinary conversation all morning, though even now it wasn't loud, "that is the entire problem, and you just said it out loud in front of everyone. If you had known who I was, you would have behaved differently. Which means the way you behaved for the last 40 minutes is the way you behave when you believe the person in front of you doesn't matter. That's not a lapse. That's who you are when you think no one's keeping score. No one in the room answered, because there was no answer to it. Nathaniel didn't draw the moment out. He turned slightly toward Edmund and spoke without taking his eyes off the three executives. I'd like their system access suspended. All three, effective now, before they have a chance to touch anything they shouldn't. Edmund gave a small nod, and somewhere below them a security team briefed in advance began doing exactly that. On the conference table inside the tank, the laptops that had displayed the alert now displayed something else, screens quietly logging themselves out and refusing to log back in. Marcus's phone, still in his hand, showed him the same thing it was about to show all three of them. The termination notices reached their devices where they stood. There was no drama in the delivery. No shouting, no security dragging anyone toward an elevator. Just a message, official and brief, arriving on 3 phones at once, the way the mocking laughter had arrived through an open door an hour earlier. Marcus read his and said nothing. Preston read his, and the cleverness drained out of his face, leaving something younger and more frightened underneath. Diane read hers and closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, she was looking at the man she'd spent the morning dismissing as a candidate who should have known better than to hope. You can't do this in an instant, Preston said finally, his voice stripped of every edge it had carried all morning. There are processes. There are procedures. You can't just. Everything happening right now was authorized by the board before I walked into this building, Nathaniel answered. The three of you were never on trial for one bad morning. You were on trial for years, and this morning was only the day the verdict happened to be read. None of it is sudden. You've simply been standing on the wrong side of a decision made 2 weeks ago, and you spent the last hour proving the board made the right one. The floor had gone completely still. The younger staff who'd drifted toward the commotion, half expecting to watch a tired applicant get escorted out, instead watched the 3 most powerful people on the floor absorb the fact that the applicant had been their superior the entire time. A few of them exchanged glances that were not quite relief and not quite fear, the recognition of people who had spent years learning to survive a system that had just, without warning, stopped ruling over them. Marcus made one last attempt to hold his ground, because men like Marcus always do. You listened to us through a door and made a decision about 3 careers based on 1 conversation. That's not leadership. That's a trap. Nathaniel looked at him for a long moment. When he answered, there was no cruelty in it, only a clarity that was harder to stand under than anger would have been. I didn't set a trap. I sat in a chair. Everything you said, you chose to say to a man you decided couldn't hurt you. I didn't put those words in your mouth, Marcus. I just made sure, for once, that someone who mattered was close enough to hear them. That's not a trap. That's the first honest performance review this floor has had in years. He turned away from the 3 of them then, a dismissal in itself, and looked out across the open floor at the staff who had watched the whole thing unfold with no power to stop it or start it. His eyes found Maya at her desk, and he held her gaze long enough for her to understand that the water and the sentence had not gone unnoticed. Before he let it go, Edmund stepped closer and spoke low, so only the 2 of them could hear. The board authorized you to remove people. It didn't expect you to do it 40 minutes after you walked in the door. I didn't remove them, Nathaniel said, watching the floor rather than the chairman. They removed themselves. I only stayed in the chair long enough to let them finish. Below the windows, the city went on being gray and indifferent. Inside the tower, the 3 people who had run its daily life stood holding phones that no longer connected them to anything, in a room full of people who had spent years being afraid of them and were only now beginning to breathe. The 40 minutes were over. What Nathaniel had come to measure, he had measured. The far harder work. Deciding what to do with everything that measurement had revealed was only beginning to take shape in the silence that had swallowed the executive floor. The 3 of them did not leave quietly. People who have spent years believing themselves untouchable rarely do. The first thing that filled the silence after the termination notices was the sound of them turning on one another. Marcus recovered his voice first and used it to build a wall between himself and the morning. It had been Diane who scheduled the interview, Diane who brought the resume into the room and put it in everyone's hands. He had only reacted to what was said in front of him. Preston, hearing his own exposure in that, cut across him to point out that Marcus had done most of the talking, that Marcus had called security, Marcus who'd told a man to collect his things and get off the floor. Diane stood between the two of them and said, with the flat exhaustion of someone watching a partnership dissolve in real time, that they'd all laughed, that not one of them had lowered his voice, and that pretending otherwise now was beneath even them. Nathaniel let them do it. He stood near the windows with Edmund at his shoulder and watched three people who had run a company together spend their last minutes in the building trying to survive at one another's expense. He understood he was watching the culture explain itself more honestly than any of them ever had. Loyalty that only exists while it's profitable isn't loyalty, it's an arrangement, and arrangements come apart the instant they stop paying. Security escorted the three of them out, down through the tower they'd ruled that morning and into the gray afternoon. The floor they left behind did not celebrate. That was the thing Nathaniel noticed most. No cheering, no visible relief, only a careful, watchful quiet. The quiet of people who'd learned long ago that removing one set of tyrants guaranteed nothing, and who were waiting to see what kind of man had taken their place. It was Maya who broke that quiet, though she hadn't meant to. Nathaniel had asked Edmund for a room and a handful of staff who understood how the floor actually ran, and Maya was among those sent to him. She came into the smaller conference room where he'd settled, hands folded in front of her, carrying the weariness of someone who'd watched authority destroy people all morning and didn't yet trust that this authority would be different. "You brought me water," Nathaniel said before she could decide how to begin. 40 minutes in, when everyone else on this floor was pretending I wasn't there. I'd like to understand why. Maya looked at him for a moment, deciding how honest to be with a man who could now end her career with a sentence. "Because it was wrong," she said finally. "What they were doing. I couldn't stop it, and I was afraid to try. The water was the only thing I could do that felt like anything at all. I'm not going to pretend it was brave. It wasn't. It was the smallest possible thing. It was the only decent thing that happened on this floor in 40 minutes, Nathaniel answered. Don't measure it against what you wish you'd done. Measure it against what everyone else did, which was nothing. He asked her then the question he'd really brought her in to answer, not about Marcus or Diane or Preston, but about everyone else. How many people on this floor and the floors below had spent years watching this kind of thing and staying silent because silence was the price of keeping a job? How deep did the fear go? How much of Sterling Industries had been built to protect the powerful from ever hearing the word no? Maya told him. She told him about the two colleagues who had spoken up in the past year and been quietly reassigned into roles designed to make them quit. She told him about meetings where good ideas died because they came from the wrong mouths, about promotions that tracked loyalty rather than results, about a whole floor that had learned to read three people's moods and arrange itself accordingly. She wasn't describing three bad executives. She was describing a system. Nathaniel listened with the still attention of a man who had suspected exactly this, and needed to hear it confirmed by someone who had lived inside it. When she finished, he sat with it for a moment, and the decision he'd been carrying since the 40th minute settled into its final shape. Removing three people who'd exposed themselves in front of the whole floor had been the easy part, and he didn't pretend otherwise. They had made the decision for him. But the fear Maya was describing hadn't been created by three people. It had been created by a structure, one that would simply grow new cruel people to fill the empty chairs if he did nothing else. The three terminations were a verdict already earned. What came next couldn't be a verdict, it had to be a rebuild, and a rebuild couldn't happen in 40 minutes. So he chose the harder thing. He told Edmund that afternoon that the morning's firings were the end of the theater, not the beginning of a purge. A purge was easy, and it was performance, and performance was exactly the disease he'd been hired to cure. He wouldn't go floor to floor removing people on the strength of a bad reputation. Instead, he'd run a full, unhurried review of how the company actually treated its people, from the executive floor down to the applicants who never made it past the front desk. He wanted to understand the incentives before he touched them, because the alternative was to keep firing the same kind of person forever, and he had no intention of doing this twice. The review took months, and it wasn't dramatic the way the morning had been. It was slow, unglamorous, occasionally thankless. Nathaniel sat with people at every level of the company and asked them the same questions he'd asked Maya, and he learned to tell the difference between those who had survived the old culture by making themselves small and those who had thrived in it by making others smaller. He kept the first group and rebuilt around them. The second group he let go. Not with the swift satisfaction of the first morning, but with the deliberate care of someone removing structural rot without bringing down the walls he still needed. He changed the machinery underneath the people, too, which no one outside the company ever heard about. He rebuilt how promotions were decided, so results mattered more than whose mood you'd learned to manage. He rebuilt how the company hired, and how it treated the people it didn't hire, because the way an organization handled the ones it turned away told him more about its character than any mission statement ever could. A candidate rejected with respect became someone who spoke well of the company for years. A candidate left in a chair for 40 minutes and mocked through an open door became a story about who you really were, and Sterling Industries had come within one honest phone call of becoming exactly that story. Not everyone welcomed the changes. People in the middle of the company who had learned to succeed by the old rules resented being asked to succeed by new ones, and some of them left on their own. Nathaniel let them. He'd stopped believing years ago that a leader could keep everyone. What a leader could do was decide which people the company was built to reward, and every person who left because the new rules didn't favor them was, in its own quiet way, confirmation that the rules were finally aimed at the right things. Maya watched all of it from closer than she'd expected. Nathaniel hadn't forgotten the water, and more than that, he hadn't forgotten what her fear had told him about the company. She understood the floor in a way the org chart never could, and he gave her the room and the standing to say the things she'd spent a year swallowing. She didn't become a symbol or a reward for good behavior. She became useful, which was a far greater form of respect, and she grew into it the way people do when someone finally removes a ceiling they'd assumed was permanent. The results came slower than the morning's drama, and lasted longer. Within a few months, the numbers the board could see had begun to turn, and the numbers they couldn't see, whether people spoke up in meetings, whether good ideas survived long enough to be tried, had turned first. Clients who had drifted away during the years of loss began to return, not because of any single announcement, but because the people they dealt with had stopped being afraid, and people who aren't afraid do better work. The shareholders saw a recovery. The staff felt a change no shareholder report could measure. Nathaniel never made a speech about it. He wasn't the kind of man who mistook applause for achievement, and he'd seen too many leaders make that mistake. He simply did the work, week after unremarkable week, and let the results speak in the only language he trusted, the slow accumulation of a company that had quietly started treating its people as though they mattered. There was a morning, some months after the first one, when Nathaniel walked into the office prepared for him as Chief Operating Officer for what was, in a real sense, the first time. He'd been running the company for months, but from conference rooms and hallways and the desks of the people he was trying to understand, he'd never quite settled into the office itself. On this morning he did. There was no applause when he entered. That was what he noticed, and what he'd come, in an odd way, to want. The floor didn't rise to celebrate him, and it didn't go silent with fear the way it had that first morning. It simply went on working. The ordinary sound of a company that had stopped organizing itself around the moods of the powerful. That ordinary sound was the truest measure of everything the last several months had accomplished. He stood in the doorway and thought about the low chair outside the tank, where he'd sat for 40 minutes with a folder on his knee and a cup of water going warm beside him. He'd learned more in those 40 minutes than the board had learned in 3 years of meetings. Not because he was cleverer than the board, but because he'd put himself in the one position the board never occupied, the position of the person with no power. And he'd let the company show him how it treated someone it believed it never had to answer to. That was the whole thing, in the end. A company doesn't reveal its character to the people it's trying to impress. It reveals its character to the people it thinks it can ignore. Every long meeting the board had ever held, every strategy session and quarterly review, had been a room full of powerful people performing for other powerful people, and none of it had ever come close to the plain, unguarded truth a man in a plain jacket could gather simply by sitting in a chair and being underestimated. Maya found him there in the doorway later that morning, a candidate's resume in her hand. Someone applying for a role 2 levels down, someone with a gap in their history, not unlike the one 3 people had once laughed at through a door. She didn't say anything clever about it. She simply told him the candidate was waiting downstairs, that she'd already gone down to bring them coffee and let them know exactly how long the process would take, because no one was going to sit in a chair on her floor wondering whether they mattered. Nathaniel looked at the resume, then at her, and something in his face eased in a way it hadn't all year. "That's the whole job," he said. "That right there. Everything else is just the part that makes the news." He didn't hire that candidate himself, and made a point of not interfering with the decision, because a culture that depended on one good man watching over it wasn't a culture at all, only a longer pause before the next Marcus Kane arrived. What mattered was that the person downstairs would be treated the same whether they were hired or not, and that the treatment wouldn't depend on anyone important happening to be listening. He'd built the listening into the walls. That had been the point of all of it. Edmund came to see him near the end of that season, and the two men stood at the tall windows where Nathaniel had made his single phone call months earlier, looking out at the same gray city that had never cared one way or the other about any of it. The chairman said what boards eventually say, that the numbers were good, that the recovery had exceeded every projection, that bringing Nathaniel in had been fully vindicated. Nathaniel accepted it without particular pride. "The numbers were always going to come back," he said. "The products were fine. The market was fine. The only thing broken was how this place treated the people who couldn't fight back. You can't fix that with a strategy deck. You fix it by deciding, every single day, that the person with the least power in the room is the one whose treatment tells you the truth about who you are." Edmund considered that. "Most people learn that lesson too late to do anything with it," he said. "If they learn it at all." "I learned it the hard way," Nathaniel answered, and didn't explain what he meant, because he didn't need to. The years he'd stepped away from work, the years 3 executives had turned into a punchline through a door, had taught him exactly what it felt like to be written off by people who decided you no longer counted. He hadn't come to Sterling Industries to punish 3 people for reminding him of that feeling. He'd come to make sure the company stopped being a machine for producing it. The story, when it traveled through the industry, became the one everyone repeated because it was satisfying in a simple way: a single father left waiting outside his own office for 40 minutes, then firing everyone inside. It was true as far as it went, and it went nowhere near the actual point. The 40 minutes were never the story. The 40 minutes were only the diagnosis. The story was everything that came after: the slow, unglamorous work of rebuilding a place so that no one would ever again have to sit in that chair wondering whether they were about to be laughed at through a door. Nathaniel understood the industry would remember the wrong part, and made his peace with it. The people who needed to understand the right part were inside the building, and they'd learned it the only way a lesson like that ever truly takes. By watching it become the ordinary way things were done, week after week, until no one could remember it having been any other way. A good leader doesn't measure people by their clothes, their titles, or the gaps in their history. He measures an organization by how it treats the ones who come to it with nothing but hope and no power to demand respect, because that treatment is the mirror in which a company's real face appears. Respect isn't a courtesy a business can afford or skip depending on the quarter. It's the foundation. And everything Sterling Industries built after that gray Tuesday morning was built on the plain fact that one man had sat in a chair long enough to find out whether the foundation was there, and then spent everything he had making sure it would be, for good.